Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Fimi History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Dr. John Ermer, who is an adjunct professor in the history department at Florida International University. Dr. Ermer areas of concentration include Latin America, Cuba, the Caribbean, and the United States, with emphasis on legal history and the histories of migration, citizenship, and identity. We will be discussing Lebanese and Syrian Cubans. So let's have a listen.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Ermer, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Fimi History, to talk about the Syrian and Lebanese community in Cuba. And so before we start, I'll just have you do a brief introduction of yourself. You can go ahead.
Well, thank you for having me. This is really exciting. I'm always excited to talk about my research. My name is John Ermer, as you said. I am a faculty member at Ransom Everglades School in Miami, Florida. I'm also adjunct lecturer at Florida International University, and I hold a PhD in Atlantic history with a focus on Cuba and the Caribbean.
What were the main factors driving Syrian and Lebanese migration to Cuba in early 20th century?
So actually the main flow of migration started in the late 19th century. As early as the 1870s, I have evidence of a man by the name of Jose Yabor of Ottoman origins living on the corner of Monte and Figuras in Havana. Jose was a tradesperson. It's not entirely clear what his business was, but he likely started out as some sort of itinerant pack peddler before settling in Havana. By the 1880s, we have evidence of a much larger community living in Havana, where I have baptism records of several Lebanese and Syrian families baptizing their children at a local church, particularly San Nicolas de Bari, which is located kind of at the epicenter of where this community would eventually thrive in the outskirts of Havana at first, and then kind of in the middle of Havana as the city began to grow. So I have evidence of in 1885, the Pichara family baptizing their daughter Maria, who was, quote, according to the baptismal records, the legitimate daughter of Don Gabriel Pichara and Paula Francois, naturales or natives of Lebanon in Syria and vecinos of this parish. Vecinos is a term that literally means neighbor, but really speaks to a kind of belonging in the local community. And then later that day, the same priest, Father Jorge Basabe, baptized another Lebanese child who belonged to the Sokar family. And again, you see several of these records in the church records of the time, and also you start to see the proliferation of Lebanese and Syrian businesses.
Wow, it's just amazing that, the popular narrative is that, people migrated at a certain period of time, but as you've discovered, it's much earlier than that. So how did Syrian and Lebanese maintain their cultural practices while integrating into Cuban society?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Euris Charon, who's a Cuban scholar, has called the Lebanese Syrian population in Cuba the most assimilatable, because they really did blend in, right? They had a lot of cultural similarities being a Mediterranean population that allowed them to kind of fit in wherever they wanted in Cuban society, to a certain extent. Um, in colonial Cuba, Syrian emigres found, really similar regimes of belonging as they had at home, where, a diverse and polycentric legal system afforded kind of several really interesting ways in which to find justice and belonging, which was really situated in a local understanding of belonging based on reputation, civic participation, and you know kind of demonstrating the hallmarks of belonging, things like owning property,
Mhm.
going to church, and integrating oneself into the community, which, as the baptismal records that I mentioned in the last answer kind of showed, their co-religious identities allowed them to kind of slip in relatively easily. Even those Lebanese and Syrians of Orthodox origin um, really kind of started going to Catholic Church, the records show, and integrating themselves into Cuban society that way. Um, but they also founded a wide variety of cultural and mutual aid societies
Mhm.
that fostered a sense of community within the Syrian and Lebanese community, as well as allowing them to demonstrate a willingness to participate in the Cuban project and really integrate into the community. I mean, there's a huge list of organizations as early as the first decade of the 20th century. You had Progreso Sirio, which was founded by Gabriel Malouf. You had quite the largest Sociedad Libanesa de La Habana. You had Asociación Unión Líbano-Cuba. You had the Centro Al-Attad. You had Líbano, Syria, de Santa Amalia. I mean, the list goes on. And so, what these organizations really did is they helped new arrivals find jobs. They helped new arrivals learn Spanish,
Mhm.
and they really helped people get on their feet. In the mid early, maybe in the mid 20th century, as early as the 1930s, these organizations sort of started to shift their focus more towards fostering a sense of community and maintaining the local culture, the ethnic identity, right? So then they had Arabic classes for the children born in Cuba so
Wow.
that they would learn Arabic. They would hold game nights where they would play backgammon and dominoes, right? Backgammon definitely popular among the Lebanese and Syrian community all over the world, and also dominoes very popular
Yeah.
in Cuba. They would have cultural events. The Sociedad Libanesa de La Habana had a yearly cultural event called Un Día en Líbano, where they would rent out the garden space next to several breweries around town, and it would change locations every year, where they would have Lebanese and Syrian foods. They would have typical music. They would have demonstrations of dance and poetry readings and other cultural kind of hallmarks that they were able to show their Cuban neighbors and also foster a sense of pride in the younger generation born on the island.
No, that's great that there wasn't that many challenges. 'Cause I would have thought that the challenge would, of course, not speaking the language of Spanish, but it wasn't. There was school. So, when the Syrian and Lebanese migrated to Cuba, were there resources that they brought with them to assist in them flourishing in Cuba at all?
So this population has often been called as Camila Pastor said, a floating island of elsewhere, which speaks to the transnational networks that they built and maintained. Um, Oftentimes, people would bring, a starter pack of things to sell, whether it be cloth or miscellaneous quote unquote objects from the Holy Land that they would, sell to people for religious reasons or luxury goods. Some brought their skills with them. Many of them were talented jewelers and other artisans. But by and large, they would maintain these transnational networks and oftentimes make several trips back and forth across the Atlantic to pick up supplies, to bring back to Cuba, to sell, or they would maintain connections, business partners in the Levant who would ship them things to sell on the island. And many of them started off as itinerant peddlers. So these pack peddlers would go to rural communities typically that weren't well served by other businesses and sell them things like cloth, uh, things like dry goods, and other things that they would have difficulty accessing. Some of them came from the United States, some of them came from France, some of them came from as close as Havana. But the goods that they sold were harder to find in rural areas. And so they really made a name for themselves servicing these communities and also eventually settling in many of these communities, which is why the population was so spread out on the island. I mean, certainly there was a core population in Havana, being the capital and the biggest city, the economic engine of the island, but you could find people of Lebanese and Syrian descent in the second city, Santiago. You could find them in other smaller cities like Holguín, Manzanillo, Santa Amalia, Santa Clara, um, and really anywhere, because eventually they would make friends, establish connections in a lot of these rural towns, and when they decided that it was time to settle down and start a brick and mortar business, they would choose some of these towns to do so.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. And then did at all the Cuban government assist in any of this migration to the Syrians and Lebanese?
Yeah, the Cuban government really had a concerted effort into bringing immigrants to the island to help settle it, but their focus was more on Western Europe. They wanted to attract what they saw as more civilized and modern Western Europeans. Certainly Spaniards and people from the Canary Islands, those were the largest groups to come to Cuba, but also they really wanted to attract people from places like Northern Italy,
Mhm.
from Denmark, from Norway, Germany, right? To bring these people that they saw as more modern and, in their eyes at the time, the pinnacle of civilization, uh, as problematic as that all is, and bring them to the island in hopes of modernizing and quote unquote civilizing Cuba, right?
Yeah.
Um, Often what they found is other people coming to the island that they weren't necessarily planning on, and some of those were the Lebanese and Syrians. There weren't necessarily efforts to help these people once they got to the island. In fact, um, my forthcoming book that I have co-edited with a colleague of mine um, focuses on Triscornia, which was the immigration processing center in Havana, kind of a sister center to Ellis Island, built at the same time by the same people, opened the same year as the second Ellis Island in 1900, built by the U.S. Marine Hospital Service, and served the same function of processing immigrants, but also raising barriers to those who they are deemed rather as undesirable, right? And in many cases, um, people from the Ottoman Empire, which was what ruled over the Levant and Syria and Lebanon at the time, were seen as you know inferior others, right? Or
Mhm.
diseased migrants. Many of them were associated with diseases like trachoma, which was a really contagious disease of the eye. Um, and so they were subject to health screenings and other barriers to entry. And in many cases, they were denied entry to the island. So rather than helping in many cases, what we found was that people of Lebanese and Syrian origins early on were turned away and re-embarked on the boat that brought them in the first place and sent back to an Ottoman port. There was a great case that I found in the archival records of a man by the name of Abraham Nasser, who arrived on the island sometime around the turn of the century, and around the year 1905 probably went back to the Ottoman Empire
Mhm.
to settle some things that he had pending there, and also to marry a wife, right? To find a wife, in other words. And when he did and came back to the island, she was admitted, but he was denied because he had contracted trachoma
Oh,
on the
wow.
way over. Um, his brother, who was still on the island in Cuba, found a lawyer who was actually the first lawyer of color on the island, a man by the name of Juan Latapierre. Um, he defended this man, but ultimately the U.S. occupation government at the time, under the U.S. governor general, or not general, the U.S. governor at the time was Charles Magoon, um, resolved to re-embark this man and send him back to the Ottoman Empire. I don't know where he ended up, or if he ever comes back to Cuba. The archival record kind of loses him at that point,
Mhm.
but it's just one of many examples of these barriers being raised to potential immigrants to the island.
Well, it just again, it's just the story of how people have traveled and where they actually end up and what that whole story entails. And I know you mentioned it before in one of the previous answers, is that where did most of the Syrian and Lebanese immigrate to in or settle in Cuba? And if you can just, I guess, elaborate a little bit more as to why they would have settled, outside of the capital as well.
Yeah, well, like I said, they settled in Havana mostly. Havana being the largest city, the political and economic and cultural center of the island. Um, the community really found a place outside the original walls of the city. So there was an extramural thoroughfare called Monte that ran out of the city and originally built to go out to the big sugar plantations and engines that were on the fringes of the city. And they found a place there very close to where the Chinese immigrants also settled. And while there is an official Barrio Chino in Havana now, there is not a Little Lebanon or Little Syria, as it were. But this was essentially the unofficial Little Syria, Little Lebanon. And as I mentioned earlier, kind of the little parish there, San Nicolas, uh, acted as the focal point of the community. So really, the intersection of Monte and San Nicolas, which was also the street that the church was on, um, featured prominently in the community as kind of a meeting space and a hub. Today, there is a park dedicated to the Arab immigrants to Cuba, a little further down Monte, closer to the capital, than San Nicolas is. But it really speaks to the critical mass of Syrian and Lebanese people who settled in this area in the early 20th century. And one can imagine that you would find several businesses that made reference to the Middle East, right? Either mentions of the Holy Land, vaguely, right? Or Lebanon in particular. Almacenes El Líbano was a big store on the corner of San Nicolas and Monte that sold clothing and cloth, but also, some other things as well. There were jewelry stores, there were bakeries, there was a large uh, laboratory for medical testing and other things that I'll probably get to later, but um, really it was a bustling neighborhood, and it still is, although far fewer people of Lebanese and Syrian descent live there now.
No, and
As
no,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead.
As far as the rest of the island, like I said, the pack peddlers would find local communities where they'd find a sense of belonging and usually just settle there. Some of them are, larger provincial towns like Orguin or others. But really, they spread all over the island to small towns like Placetas, where I have an a 93-year-old lady I interviewed a few years ago, who's now unfortunately passed away, told me about how her family just kind of settled there because they found it nice. And her father tried to establish a homegrown silk industry in Cuba by smuggling in the silkworms and the mulberry trees from the Ottoman Empire. And the silkworms didn't take. She talked about how he had the trees all lined up in a row and it was very organized and everything. But the climate just wasn't there for silk production. But that's just one example of, somebody finding some land in a small town and trying to make, the best way for himself and his family. It didn't work out with the silk. He eventually took to pack peddling, and then eventually started a store. But again, you have so many of these stories of just these itinerant pack peddlers, uh, finding a home in a rural community somewhere.
No, again, just again that same narrative of just these stories that are being uncovered and what you're researching, which is just fabulous. And I guess it kind of goes to in what ways did this community impact Cuba's economy, particularly in trade and commerce.
Yeah, well, they filled a niche in many cases, especially in those rural communities where the pack peddlers would bring much needed goods. Um, I have a colleague working on potentially working on how some of these pack peddlers in Cuba and throughout Latin America would sometimes, you know, uh, sell things to uh, workers in United Fruit Company plantations for company script, take this company script to the company store, say, hey, let me get all of these American made goods in the company store, and then take them 2 towns over and sell them to people over there who needed them, right? So they're filling a niche. And again, I haven't found evidence of that in the archival record. That's more anecdotal, but they were certainly filling this niche in the rural communities and also involved in import export. The Gabriel Malouf, who I mentioned earlier, was known for having a large luxury goods store and import export business in Havana. He was a very early immigrant, coming right as Cuba was earning independence from Spain, and established his business right in the heart of Havana, next to where the new capital was going to be built. And even ended up buying, supposedly, according to him in his correspondence to his brother back in Lebanon, the house that was built for General Maximo Gomez, who, of course, was a hero of Cuban independence. I haven't been able to confirm that, but according to him, that's what happened. And he based his business there. He eventually lived in a nice hilltop home in La Vibora. Um, but again, import export, mostly textiles and luxury goods. Maluf was also lucky enough to be able to leverage U.S. citizenship. So he did a two-leg migration, first to New York, where he somehow acquired U.S. citizenship without the requisite number of years by maybe fudging the numbers a little bit and saying that he had lived in Pennsylvania for quite a while, when really he hadn't even left the Ottoman Empire yet. Uh, and then coming to Havana, because he made a lot of Cuban friends in New York, they kept talking up Cuba and Cuban independence. And when they returned to the island after independence, he came with them, having already kind of picked up some Spanish in New York. Um, these are just a few examples, but again, artisans in Havana like jewelers, tailors, import exports, textiles, dry goods, um, you know, similar to the Lebanese and Syrian populations in other parts of the Americas. Cuba was no exception there.
No, it definitely sounds so. And I guess what was, the Syrian and Lebanese, what was their impact to Cuban culture as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few impacts to Cuban culture. Again, as Jaron said, they're the most assimilatable. So in many ways, they kind of just um, seamlessly integrated themselves into Cuban society, but with some cultural elements that they maintained too, like the food. There was a lot of Lebanese restaurants in Cuba. Um, there was also a famous pair of brothers who were doctors, Moises and Alejandro Chiriac, who were the first to open blood banks in Cuba. They invented the one drop test for syphilis serum. They created an RH typing test for one drop of blood. Um, they were one of them, Moises, was the director of the largest hospital in Havana at the time. So there was a lot of well-known people of Lebanese and Syrian background. You know, even in the revolution in '59, the second but longest serving minister of justice in the revolutionary government was of Lebanese descent, Alfredo Yabor Malouf, um, who wasn't the first minister of justice, but did start in the role in 1959 and held it until 1972. So, there's definitely a presence on the island, although I'm not sure that you have examples like Al Pastor tacos in Mexico, where, the cultural diffusion is quite as clear.
Okay. And were they able to practice their religion openly? Because you mentioned that they had assimilated to, let's say, whatever other religions that were there, but were they able to continue with what their regular religion was?
Yeah, so the vast majority of the Lebanese and Syrians who migrated to Cuba were either Maronite Catholics or Orthodox Christians. So, the Catholic Church is most well known through the Latin Rite, which is the largest and most prevalent in Europe and the Americas. But there are some Eastern rites within the Catholic Church that still have allegiance to Rome and the Pope and fall under the Holy See's authority, but have differences in practice and in form in some cases. And so Maronite Catholics, are able to attend Mass in Latin Rite churches, and many of them did. Many of the Greek Orthodox Christian and the Orthodox Christian Lebanese and Syrians also kind of just rolled into the Catholic practice because that was what was available to them on the island. And a few of them were converts to Protestant religions, either because they went to the American college in Beirut, or other American or European missionaries had converted them to Protestant religions. And they found some places to practice Protestant faiths in Havana in particular, not so much out in the rural areas, but certainly in Havana where there was enough Americans there that there were some Protestant faith communities where they could practice their religion, although many of them also converted to Catholic Christianity in order to more fully integrate with their neighbors, and again show that desire to become part of the community. As far as Muslim Lebanese and Syrians, it was far different for them, but many of them still practice their religion at home. There were far fewer of them, but there are evidence of them in the archival records, and they mostly practice at home. The first mosque in Havana just opened in the last decade, so they didn't have an organized and central place to practice, but many of them brought their prayer rugs with them, practiced at home. But again, the vast majority were Maronites who also had, maybe some friction with the Latin Rite churches and hierarchy in Havana. In the archival record, I found evidence of a Maronite missionary sent by the patriarch in Beirut to minister to the Maronite community in Cuba, and the Archbishop of Havana sending some choicely worded letters to the patriarch, carefully, but you can definitely read the hostility in the lines saying like, hey, we have this representative of yours here in my archdiocese. You did not ask me for permission to send such an emissary of yours. So if you've ever seen Hamilton, you know that back and forth at the end between Hamilton and Burr, where they're very politely disagreeing with one another in an unpolite way. Um, it was very similar to that. There is also a concerted effort prior to the revolution to convert that church, San Nicolas, to a Maronite church. The closest they were able to accomplish to that was the establishment of a side chapel to Saint Charbel, who is a ascetic Lebanese hermit monk. Um, but they weren't able to actually take possession of the church. I imagine they would have had to have clawed that away from the archbishop's hands by force. But again, just this year, actually, in February, a Maronite church did open in Havana to minister to the Lebanese and Syrian community there. I also had an interview where the woman I interviewed had kind of this curio cabinet in her home, and right next to a picture of Our Lady of Charity, the patroness of Cuba, was a picture of Saint Charbel. And so she was kind of showing her dual identity through the showing of these saints and these religious images, and it was really cool.
Definitely. This leads, I guess, into my next question where, how did they balance between, this Syrian and the Lebanese descendants in Cuba? How did they balance their Middle Eastern heritage and, of course, integrating in terms of with the Cuban national identity?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Many of them maintained a sort of dual identity where they were Cuban and they're wholeheartedly Cuban, but they're also something else,
Yeah.
right? Um, and again, I interviewed a woman by the name of Rosa Maria Diaz Chiriac in Havana, who told me a story about how she was able to attend a conference of Lebanese organizations in Beirut in 1997. And the story was really kind of sad in many ways, um, because she went to Lebanon for, quote, a congress because I was a member of the Association of Arab Americans and they do congresses, end quote. Cuban officials supported the trip, which was probably in their eyes an attempt at like soft diplomacy, right? But Diaz recounted in the interview how, quote, first we went to Syria, then we went to Lebanon. I had a great time. I really loved it. It was beautiful. We got to visit some towns. We went to Gazir, where my family was from, Junie, which is up the mountain. Well, everything is up a mountain. Truly, it was a lovely trip. My mother always wanted to go, but I think I was the only one from my family who had the chance to go. And the truth is, I really loved it, end quote. She went on to talk about how she went to a cousin's house and how it reminded her of Cuba, but not the Cuba she left in 1997, but the Cuba of a bygone era, right? And ultimately, where the story went was, she starts crying, and while relating the story, you could just see a sadness for the community in Cuba that she once knew. And Cuba's her home, right? She was born and she was raised in Cuba, in that same area of Havana that I was talking about with all the Lebanese businesses. She spent a lot of time talking about her favorite businesses and how she would go get sweets from the bakery, and then she would go bother the gentleman who ran this store or that store with her friends. And going to Lebanon for her was a way to recapture those memories of Cuba from her childhood, when this community was still flourishing, was still kind of centered on this area. Um, and that's not the case anymore, right? When I visited her in her home in Belalo, which is a little ways away from there on the outskirts of Havana. Um, she had relatives that I also visited in La Habana Vieja. The community is really spread out now, and there aren't those cultural touch points and that community that they once had. The only thing that really even resembles that now is the Unión Árabe, which is really an umbrella organization for what's left of all of the panoply of organizations and associations that I mentioned earlier, where there were Lebanese and Syrian organizations in the tens, maybe close to 50 of them in Havana in the 1950s and 40s. And now there's just the one where they all kind of came together to form the one in the late 1970s, which is the Unión Árabe, located on Prado. Um, and that's where they all kind of come together for things. I was there while the Lebanese ambassador to Cuba gave a speech. I was also there for a dance recital of traditional Middle Eastern dances. Um, but really few of the people there speak Arabic anymore. There's nowhere really to enjoy the food. The lady, Rosa, whose families call her La Eléctrica because she has energy for days. Um, she showed me a cookbook that she wrote, a Lebanese cookbook with a colleague of hers from the Unión Árabe. And when I asked her if she is able to enjoy cooking any of this food anymore, she's like, no, really, the ingredients are hard to come by, and so I don't really cook Lebanese food anymore. So again, that return to Lebanon for her was a return in many ways to the Cuba she grew up in.
Definitely. And I'm glad that you were able to share some of these stories, because I mean, that's I guess that's the fuel, right? To be able to still talk, to still discuss, and to still bring this to the forefront, and to make sure that it's not forgotten. And I know, Professor Ermer, that you mentioned a lot of the resources. So, what were, could you just go into some of the resources that you were able to access when researching, the Syrian and Lebanese in Cuba? And, were there challenges in obtaining some of these records?
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, the first place I went was um, the Museo Casa Los Árabes in La Habana Vieja, which is in the touristy part of Havana. It's a museum dedicated to um, Arabic culture and the legacies of Arabic speaking immigrants to the island, where I met the president, Rigoberto Menendez, who, great guy, really, really useful resource for me. I number him among my friends on the island now. Um, he wrote a kind of a nuts and bolts history of the cultural influences of Middle Eastern culture in Arabic dating back all the way to Columbus, right? Um, but he kind of pointed me in some directions, and I ultimately went to the Unión Árabe, where I was able to meet several people of Lebanese and Syrian descent,
Mhm.
with the help of the librarian there, who's also great. And I did a lot of oral histories.
Yeah.
I also was able to access records at the National Library and the National Archive of Cuba. That required institutional support from an institution on the island. So FANJE, the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez, and Dr. Reynaldo Funes were a huge help to me in being able to access the National Archive. I did a lot of work at the National Archives where I was able to access the records of a lot of the associations that I mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And again, the archivists there were great. They made the best of what was available to them and really helped me to understand how the archive was organized and how best I could use the resources there to help me in my research. From there, I also was able to leverage some of the connections from the Unión Árabe to do some more other oral history interviews with some people. Um, and I was also able to access the archives at the Archdiocese of Havana, which was also very difficult for other reasons, not because I needed institutional support, but because they're kind of guarded a little bit and wary of outsiders coming in and wanting to poke around. But I was able to, as I mentioned, access those letters between the Archbishop and the Patriarch about the missionary and some other records, as well as going to individual parishes and being able to access the baptismal and marriage records and such. So really, I cast a wide net. It was like putting together a puzzle in some cases. Unfortunately, my research was cut short by COVID. I had planned to return in April of 2020, where I had about 46 different interviews lined up. It was going to be the bulk of my oral history work. And of course, that trip got canceled, and I haven't been able to get back to the island since then. So unfortunately, some of those people have passed away, and others I've lost contact with. But my hope is to one day get back to the island and finish that work.
And I'm sure you will, because I mean that is just, I mean it's just so vast as to what you can still be able to access. As you know, most things are not going to be online, even though it's definitely purported as it is, but it's not. You really do have to go to where the source is to get the information that is really needed and to uncover, as you said, just those conversations, those letters back and forth. To be able to see something like that, is you have to be in the archives for that. So, Professor Ermer, what would you advise for someone researching this area of Syrian and Lebanese migration in Cuba? What advice would you be able to provide to them?
Yeah, my best advice would be to think outside the box and not be afraid of the legwork. You really have to get out there and meet people, shake hands, earn trust. It took several trips to the island to earn the trust of some of the people I was able to interview. And it really just came down to knowing people on an interpersonal level and putting in the time to earn their trust and to explain what it was I was doing. And that's really the best advice I have, is to just go there, see if there's a there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And then follow those threads as best you can. But it's a really rewarding work. There were days in the archive where I found nothing, and there were days in the archive where I would just stumble upon a treasure trove of information. So you really just have to be patient and to understand that it's going to be, like I said earlier, like putting together a puzzle. You're going to find little nuggets here and there, and you're going to have to figure out how they go together.
No, that's a great analogy. That's really great. And then, of course, as we end this episode, what would you say, as any final thoughts that you would like to provide during this particular time frame period in Cuba?
Yeah, I mean, just an understanding that Cuba is such a beautiful multicultural place that allowed immigrants to flourish. There are so many examples of immigrant communities contributing to Cuba and the construction of Cubanidad in important ways, not just the Lebanese and the Syrians, but myriad groups. Um, there's a lot of Ashkenazi Jewish Cubans. There are Chinese Cubans. There are Yucatec Cubans. Right? There are Cubans of so many different backgrounds and so many different cultures and ethnicities and races. And it's just such a beautiful society. It really is. And so I just encourage people to have an open mind about what they'll find, and to understand that there are myriad Cubanidades, right? There are so many iterations of what it means to be Cuban, that there's a lot of work for anyone looking to do work on Cuba and the immigrants there.
Oh, perfect. No, thank you so much, Professor Ermer, for coming on to the podcast and to speak about this. Has been very fascinating. And again, some themes in terms of when you're researching, and in this case, researching your family tree, that it's kind of is like a puzzle where you kind of have to put everything together. but again, seeing it from a bigger picture before you start going in very narrowing. So, but thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.